Well, hello. I had a wild weekend. Good weather, good fun. Met a bunch of local friends at a pub in a town nearby and sat in the sun and chatted with about a dozen people. Really, really fun. People here are so sweet. Also, I love it here because the locals get my worldview and they're more than game to talk about anything. A lot of the expats, they're much more guarded and worried. I think the culture wars have taken their toll. But I was talking to Belgians, French, Germans, local Portuguese people. Yeah, so it was a nice mix of people. No, I was the only American there, so a lot of concern about the rearmament and things. Everyone's having a good time, just enjoying themselves. But if they talk about current events or something, they're very concerned about this Euro rearmament plan. And it's very understandable because it's a lot of money for nothing. Absolutely nothing. And a bunch of my friends have published some good articles recently. Well, it's about the U.S. involvement in the war in Ukraine and just how deep it is. So beyond all the Maidan stuff, it's just the involvement was incredibly deep. And then there was another expose about the massacre in Odessa and how that was carried out by the Azov group and people associated with them. And that's been confirmed by international courts and investigations, including Ukrainian. So things are just complex. I can't find the Hugo Bardi one, but anyway, there's a bunch of good ones out. And the best one, I think, which really confirms what I've been thinking for a long time, is this article called Europe's Remilitarization Myth: Why Building on the Success of Rearmament is a Bad Idea. So good. And it really covers everything. So I'm going to go through that real quick and put that up. Yeah, so I don't want this to be too long, but it's important to understand this train of thought, this frame, this way of looking at the situation, the predicament we're in, because the scams they're pulling off these days. I mean, Trump, Musk, and the EU leadership, it's just ridiculous. And it doesn't end well for people because of a lot of reasons, but I'll go through this article. Okay, so I'm going to go through this real quick. I think it's an important frame through which to look at the situation. Europe's remilitarization myth: why building on the success of rearmament is a bad idea. So I'll just take you through it because he does a really good job. He is very aware, the honest sorcerer, of our predicament in terms of materials and in particular energy and how that impacts everything we do these days. And people just don't think enough about it. But this is fascinating. So, political views about the perceived or real threats aside, there is a strong case to be made that this initiative, if fully implemented, will pull the continent further deeper into the vortex of its accelerating economical and geopolitical decline. Uh, what they're talking about these days, politicians in Europe, is Rearm Europe plan. So Hugo Bardi was talking about how the propaganda machine is trying to get everybody hyped up about war in Italy again, and how it looks very familiar to what happened during World War I and leading up to World War II. And we know how those wars ended. It doesn't, the winners aside, it was a mess, a horror story. And if we push things too far this time, uh, it's going to be worse because let's get into the article. Europe is in a deep and structural crisis driven by high energy prices, a lack of innovation, high labor costs and taxes, not to mention a fierce competition from China, and now an openly hostile U.S. foreign policy. The previous global paradigm is fading. The era of rapid world trade growth looks to have passed, with EU companies facing both greater competition from abroad and lower access to overseas markets. Europe has abruptly lost its most important supplier of energy, Russia. All the while, geopolitical stability is waning, and our dependencies have turned out to be vulnerabilities. Yeah, so Russia was, you know, a real important supplier of energy back in the day. And we don't have that anymore, which is why some auto manufacturers are moving from Germany to the U.S. and stuff like that. So while the 800 billion Rearm Europe plan might provide just that, lots of investment money, the grandiose spending package might still fail without adequate energy supplies. And we just don't have, access to energy in Europe like we did. And everyone feels it. Everything is more expensive, and everyone feels it. It's kind of like, the wage stagnation in the United States, which Christopher Chris Hedges was talking about. Anyway, the primary issue with military production is that it is not productive from an economic perspective. Newly built tanks will sit in a warehouse, best case, or will be used in a war which will eventually see Europe completely destroyed. It's it's such a wasted investment for so many reasons. Um, in neither of these scenarios will weapons improve people's lives nor produce anything economically useful, such as food, consumer goods, etc. Military production is a drain on the economy, sucking in labor investments, energy, and resources while doing nothing to make a return on investment. Unless they are used in territorial expansion, securing new resources, but that's not the goal here, right? Right? Yeah, so in the olden days, Japan and Germany needed to get the oil and gas. That's one of the reasons you have to invade is to get stuff. Where are you going to steal? I wrote a piece the other day. It's like where are they going to steal the resources to fight this war with whoever, China and Russia? I mean, where are you going to go? Are you going to go to Venezuela and steal their oil and then ship it to Europe or something? Um, Parts of Africa, you're going to ask the Saudis to give it to you or what? Qatari gas. Remilitarization as a means to recover from the Great Depression in the 1930s has been a convenient myth to sell the idea to the public. In reality, it was infrastructure investment which has literally paved the way to progress, not arms manufacturing. And I'm doing this, done a lot of research on the New Deal, FDR, and that period. And it really isn't, rearmament that does it. And Germany had to rearm because they had to go out and get more resources. They had enough coal. Well, let me get into the article. In reality, it was infrastructure, right? So people can have larger families, which meant higher consumption, more cars, houses, washing machines, power lines, roads, and so on. And we had plenty of energy to do it back then. So this is a picture of a woman pumping water in Tennessee in 1942. You still had to pump water and carry it back to your shack. But with the New Deal, people started getting jobs and more money and becoming greater consumers and whatnot. So the 30s and the subsequent global war was enabled by cheap resources and successful addition of oil to the world economic system. In a sense, World War II was fought over this new resource. Both Japan and Germany were racing to get rich oil fields in Southeast Asia and the Caspian to power their war efforts and their economies. So, you play the war game, and the first thing you want to do is go out and get that energy because you need it for your ships and your planes and all that stuff. So the diesel excavators and bulldozers worked tirelessly on the foundations and laid a lot of concrete with its own diesel and coal power supply chain on top. Access to cheap and abundant liquid fuels was thus key to economic recovery. He's talking about all the freeways uh, they built back then in America and the United States. Interstate freeways, autobahns. And they had cheap energy to do it back then. We're running low now. The low hanging fruit is gone. So trying to recreate this economic boom under today's oil and resource stricken economic environment is doomed to fail. None of the benefits will come, only higher levels of indebtedness, inflation, and political tensions. You see, debts taken on for building a tank factory or converting car manufacturing plants for military purposes is not going to repay themselves, ever. Building guns is only profitable beyond using them for territorial expansion if you build them for someone other than yourself. Quote, let them destroy their country with those, then come back for more. This is how the military industrial complex in America grew big. And this is why there was no armed conflict they did not like. So, you're selling your jets to Israel and Saudi Arabia and everywhere. And you're selling your arms around the world and letting other people fight or, wage proxy wars or have civil wars. And you're making money. You're laughing back in the States, right? Europe, on the other hand, will build these factories for itself. What these upgraded car factories will produce could only be sold to their own governments, who then will have to go further into debt to pay for these weapons. This payment will then go through the entire weapons industry supply chain. Profits will be skimmed off at every step. Then, what little remains will be deducted as taxes, which will be used to pay back a tiny portion of the debt created for military investment. Sure, a few people will get richer still, but the average worker who used to make cars previously will not see his or her situation improved. Not that it would be possible to produce the steel, gunpowder, and high explosives needed without a massive subsidy from cheap fossil fuels. And where are you going to get them again, right? The Germans before World War II at least had a huge pile of high quality coal, which they could use to produce iron and cement. They also learned how to turn coal into hydrocarbons, fertilizer, and eventually liquid fuels for cars, trucks, tanks, airplanes. Hence, the time pressure to start a war before the civilian economy grew too big to be supported by coal alone. So you have to go out, you have to steal the energy from someone else. And then you kill all the Slavs because they're just a nuisance. Depletion of its own cheap mineral resources and the complete lack of hydrocarbons was the sole reason why Germany had to import 50% of its coal, 55% of its natural gas, and 31% of its crude oil from Russia. They blew up the pipeline, right? Whoever blew up the pipeline. We can't have Germany getting cheap gas from Russia, the damn Russians. How are we going to make any money that way? at least up to 2022. All of these former imports fall under some sort of sanctions today, affecting 33% of Germany's total energy consumption. Is it any wonder that energy became so expensive in Germany as well as in other parts of Europe? Those who think that a massively energy intensive remilitarization program can be powered by expensive LLG from America and Qatar, or coal shipped literally from the other side of the planet, Australia and South Africa, are deluding themselves. Think of it. All the energy you need just to move the coal, and you need a certain kind of coal to make steel and shit to build all your weapons. Since neither nuclear nor renewables could be used for this purpose, sorry, the whole idea is doomed to fail. You just can't use nuclear power to make steel. You can't get the high heat required. The Rearm Europe plan, on the other hand, has every potential to evolve into a massive Ponzi scheme, eventually sucking in every investment and pension fund, first voluntarily, then up to a certain percentage mandated by law. This supposed remilitarization of Europe could very well be the swan song of the EU. One last round of cacophony before the curtain falls. Sure, it will generate a lot of apparent economic activity in the meantime, resulting in temporary rising GDP figures. But since all of this will be financed by taking on debt and not organic productive growth of the economy, it could not, and thus will not, last forever. As soon as material and energy reality hits, the bubble will burst violently, with would-be pensioners and everyday folks left holding the bag. Western Europe is about to realize that they were but a chess piece, now past its usefulness in a grand game of big players. So for years and years, I've been talking about Great Game 2.0 and the players, the big shots, the oligarchs, the plutocrats, corrupt officials, all these kind of people playing their freaking game at the expense of life on Earth, ecocide, genocide, and just pollution and climate change. And mind you, this climate thing is going to get way out of hand. There's all kinds of new research out now about how clouds play into the whole global heating scenario. So all these models are updating all the time, and none of it looks good for anybody. So we're going to continue to kick the can down the road and ignore our problems and focus on this shit, which doesn't help you at all. So the fact that the resulting high standard of living was supported entirely by cheap fossil fuels and dominance over world affairs has just started to transpire, though. Now, with both gone, a painful sobering up is in due order. Okay, the Russian threat. The Russians are coming. Everybody, come on, you Chicago folk. Come on, you guys down here in the Algarve. You better get ready for the damn Russians. We'll all be speaking Mandarin or Russian soon. It's so bloody ridiculous. So listen to this. Let this sink in, because he's absolutely right, according to everything I've read, books over the years, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of articles and papers. Doesn't make me a genius or an expert or a journalist or anything special, but it's just something I've done, and it all tracks really well with what B is about to say here. Despite its ever more obvious victory in Ukraine, it would be foolish to think that Russia has the means and resources to overrun the entire European continent. Their progress beyond Avdiivka during 2024, the most active part of the front back then, is a good example. After a year of heavy fighting, they progressed a mere 50 kilometers, 31 miles, not more. Well, they're progressing all the time now, but it's 2025. So at this speed, it would take them another 20 years from now to reach the Polish border, 35 to be in Berlin, a half century to arrive in Paris, and 75 years to reach Lisbon, Portugal. In other words, Russia would need the entire rest of the century to complete the conquering of Europe. After all, they were fighting the entire NATO military organization already. There's This gets me back to that New York Times article. I mean, there are foreign fighters from Europe there. There always has been from the beginning. The U.S. has constantly helped them with their kill chain and targeting and all that kind of stuff, not to mention all the weapons we've given Ukraine. So Russia is already fighting NATO in a proxy war in Ukraine. So NATO military organization already who were providing all the weapons, training, tanks, artillery, satellite surveillance, air defense systems, targeting, literally everything but the he meant flesh and bone of human soldiers. So should the fighting continue, say in Poland? It would result in the mass mobilization of European troops, and the same bloody slog would go on for years and years. Are you down for that? Russia's not going to go there. You're all being played, I'm telling you. So anyway, given all that, why would Russia want to conquer Europe? What would they gain after sacrificing millions of their own soldiers and fighting a war for the rest of the century? 450 million disgruntled old people who hate them to their guts. Europe has no resources left, and it has lost its geopolitical significance a long time ago. In fact, the world could go on just fine without them, and there is nothing of significance coming from the old continent. So you're going to take over Europe for the museums, for the Louvre, and for the Van Gogh Museum and so on. That's what you're fighting for. We want those damn museums. I want to steal all the art. And there is the fact that even the Russians would be running out of oil before they could complete their mission. Not to mention young men, thanks to their falling fertility rates. And remember, fertility rates are falling globally for many, many reasons. It's complex, but they're going to continue to fall. And eventually, in 10 years or 15 years, probably, you can call me doomist if you want, but the climate's going to take a big bite out of the number of people on this planet. So who's going to fight? A bunch of pensioners are going to fight? It's ridiculous. You're being had. You're being scammed, conned. It's tragic. Wake up. In a rational world, the very idea of the world's largest state by territory and mineral reserves needing more territory should be considered too absurd to contemplate. Not in Europe, though. Despite the constant fear-mongering, it was in fact the Europeans who could not let the notion of a permanent war on Russia go. Not even after multiple failed attempts to subdue it, from Napoleon to World War I and World War II. Note how none of these major wars in Europe were started by the Russians, and how all of them somehow ended up trying to conquer it instead. So you start a war, and then you say, oh, by the way, we could use all those minerals and oil and gas from Russia, so we might as well attack them. It becomes less about the commies, some ideology. Who cares? Capitalism's so great. Why do you care if a bunch of Russian people want to be, communists? You really care about them? You don't care. Just like Israel doesn't, Israelis don't care at all about Palestinians, not in the least. So anyway, it's no different from different this time either. This was a proxy war from the get-go, aimed at overextending and unbalancing Russia by pushing NATO onto its borders and by arming a hostile regime to the teeth on their doorstep. No lesser person than the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, admitted as much earlier this month. He said, and frankly, it's a proxy war between nuclear powers, the United States helping Ukraine and Russia. So there you have it, from the horse's mouth. Um, what more needs to be said to convince you? Providing lethal aid to Ukraine is always deemed a high risk due to Russia's openly communicated sensitivity in the matter and due to their close proximity, lending them significant advantages, right? You're bringing your stuff up to the border and fighting. You don't have to ship it halfway around the world. Um, Now, with the sanctions failing, more than 1 million people dead, and military aid proving to be less and less effective in stopping the Russian advance, the U.S. has realized it's time to call it quits. No matter what saber rattling happens in Europe or what Donald Trump says from one second to the next, uh, it doesn't change the reality of the situation at all, not in the least. Uh, you know, since this war was never about territorial expansion, but securing its own borders, once the NATO threat is removed, there will be no need to continue or resume fighting. Russians are already preparing for a post war world. For them, Ukraine is just one area where they need a lasting agreement, a settlement. In their view, sanctions are now a permanent fact of life, and thus they remain focused on turning their country into an autarky. That means a completely independent, self sufficient country that doesn't need to trade with the United States. And by the way, another bordering country on Russia is China. And, if they have good relations, why would they give a damn about trading with Western Europe or the United States? And by the way, things are changing quickly. So we're not going to have the same kind of economy that we've had from the 19th century until now. It's just not going to be possible. Even if you have too cheap to meter fusion energy, because we live on a planet with finite resources, full stop, and we're heating the planet extremely rapidly due to our carbon emissions, and that's not going to change anytime soon. And it's just not good news. So PFAS aside, and birth rates, and poisoning from microplastics, and the sixth extinction, and the wrecking of the ocean, and other carbon sinks like the Amazon rainforest and whatnot. You look at the news every day in the States. Planes are falling out of the sky. People are shooting each other on buses and at parties and rallies. Jet airplanes are having mishaps right and left, tornadoes, fires, huge storms all over the place. It's almost like God Almighty is pissed off at good old Uncle Sam for some reason. And then you have, Trump's spiritual advisor going on TV with an ad saying, for $1,000, we'll pray for you until Palm Sunday, and you get this nice little Waterford crystal cross. And you get a private angel who's going to protect you from your enemies. And we're going into this magical thinking realm now. Nobody wants to know about physics or chemistry. And people are refusing to get vaccinated, so they're getting measles again. And, it just goes on and on. Why would Russia or China care? I mean, you just sit back and watch the United States destroy itself. You don't have to do anything but pray to the gods that we're not going to have a nuclear war, a strategic nuclear war. So, anyway, Russians will not fool around should push come to shove, though. They would rather nuke a few European cities first than let themselves be dragged into yet another European war, potentially lasting for decades. And Putin and Russian leadership has said so straight out. What are we going to do? What possible other thing can we do? People are saying, well, you can use your hypersonic impact weapons, and it's not going to happen. All of these things are very expensive to build and deploy and use, and nobody can afford this shit anymore. I'm sorry. And you're not going to get all enthusiastic like the Brits in World War One and just get so, our whole village is going to war. Oh, yes, that sounds like fun, Billy. Let's go. It's not going to happen. You look at Vietnam War, teach-ins to try to raise awareness for the peace movement, and people, only poor people getting destroyed in Vietnam, whether you're Vietnamese or American. Deferments if you're in college, and if you don't get the right grades, you could be drafted. And Jesus, what a mess! It didn't do anybody any good. And America lost the war anyway. If America thinks it's so fucking good at this, but they lose every time. What did they get out of Afghanistan? Security? What did they get out of Libya and Iraq? Security? Are you kidding me? And all they're getting out of Israel now is genocide. So bully for Uncle Sam. What a great warrior that motherfucker is. There is no technical, military, or strategic way for Europe to compete with any of that. Sorry. A few rented nukes on outdated missiles and aboard aging aircraft or submarines will not cut it. Militarily speaking, EU member states are third-rate players, lacking both the mineral and the industrial resources, not to mention a young and willing population, to fight another world war. The sooner this reality sets in, the sooner lasting peace can be achieved on realistic terms. So we have these demographic problems, we have these economic and resource problems and all this stuff. And people want to talk about appeasement and Neville Chamberlain, God damn the fucking appeasers, Neville Chamberlain, yeah. Give me a break, people. It is not 1938, 1940, it's not 1942. Things are vastly different than they were during the Gulf War. America isn't as powerful as it was during the Gulf War. Then what's the point in building more tanks, artillery, drones, or what have you? Well, who knows how long the EU and NATO will be here to smooth international conflicts. The North Atlantic Alliance unity is in shambles. So regardless of who's going to be in power, one thing is certain, folks. America's really fucking itself over. It's stupid. It's dumbing down. It's getting dumber by the day. And you cannot count on the United States of America for security. We're going to get our security by building peace and cooperation between countries around the world and solving major problems, hopefully, or we're going to go extinct eventually. Now, you don't care because you're just sitting on pins and needles hoping the stock market doesn't go down. So, and you can get and collect your Social Security, even though Musk is going to destroy that. You're just on pins and needles hoping it's going to last until you're 80. And the young people are like, I can't even buy a freaking house, dude. I mean, my wages are frozen. I have student debt. Healthcare could kill me tomorrow because, financially speaking. So, it's ridiculous. So the US is now openly threatening another member state, Denmark, with taking over their territory, Greenland, while Europeans can't agree how to call themselves, let alone whether to send troops to Ukraine or not. Instead of a continued conflict with Russia, we can thus expect a return to the historical norm, with petty European nation states quarreling over scarce resources. A few years from now, it might easily turn out that this whole remilitarization was actually not against the big bad boogeyman to the east, but to deal with neighboring states wanting to dominate this soon to be forgotten westernmost peninsula in Eurasia. So there you have it, 30 minutes of that. But it's such a waste on so many levels, and only these bureaucrats, legal and professional service providers to the players, the hedge funds, the big banks, the politicians, and the revolving door fed by war, that tiny little group of people is going to get filthy rich on this, but they're going to die too. Nobody gets out of this predicament. It doesn't matter how much money you have. Eventually, it's going to bite you in the ass too. So, it's so absurd, but these people are completely intransigent, and they are dogmatic and deluded and pathological in their thinking and their beliefs. And praying to God isn't going to help, folks. We've got to get busy enlightening ourselves and learning how nature works, physics, chemistry, biology. And we have to start to understand what's really important. And we have to let the past go. If not, we're going to be going back to the Middle Ages very soon. And good luck with that. So in the meantime, sit on your pins and needles and hope to God your retirement plan is going to work out for you. Or if your kids, hope that the gig economy is going to help you be able to pay your rents, your subscriptions, and all of that, because they're going to chisel away at you day in and day out until you are living on the edge like many people are today around the world. Okay, so I'm sorry for that, but go and read this article. Think about it. Look at the hyperlinks. Educate yourself and tell your leaders you're not going to go along with this Ponzi scheme, this scam. Okay? Boolean T out.